Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show of the Western Standard. It is Thursday, April the 16th. If all you have is the mainstream media, you can be forgiven thinking that nothing about the U.S. action against Iran makes any sense. The strategy of contradictory statements by President Trump, along with outrageous threats, from which the president later retreats, it even has a name, Taco. Trump always chickens out. Well, what if there is a plan? And part of it depends on confusing the enemy. Deception in war? It wouldn't be the first time. With me today is Joseph Varner, a senior fellow of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Center for North American Prosperity and Security, a former director of policy to Canada's Minister of National Defence in the Harper days, and a post-adjunct scholar at West Point's Modern War Institute. Mr. Varner, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
Mr. Varner, first question. Do we know what's actually happening now on the water in the Straits?
Well, we know that no ships that are in Iranian ports are able to leave the Persian Gulf, and we know that no ships that are going to Iranian ports are going to be able to go to the Iranian through the Straits to the Persian Gulf. So far, the Americans have 15 warships that are set up to blockade the Sea of Oman, and it seems that they're stopping and rerouting ships. And for the Iranians, the loss of their export capacity is about $13 billion per month. So that will put heavy pressure on their economy, likely collapse the real. And I think it'll be very hard in terms of foodstuffs and other goods to get in and out of the country. And what's also significant is that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps are responsible for about 40% of the country's GDP. This will be a major hit in their pocketbook as well.
Are these the kind of people who can be influenced by hits in the pocketbook? They don't seem to want to die gloriously.
Well, die gloriously rich. They're enjoying the fact that they're running the regime, and I do believe that the hardline elements are running the regime, but they also profit very heavily from that, and they use those profits for everything from their proxy militias and to arm themselves to kind of grandize and have a good life for their leadership and their families. And you'll see many of the senior leaders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and of the Iranian elite, their families live outside the country in great luxury.
Does Israel know about that?
Everyone knows about it, but no one talks about it.
Yes. That would seem to me a point of vulnerability for them. What is the relationship like between the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, that is, and the regular military services, which Iran has, the Army, Navy, and Air Force?
So during the revolution, the regular armed forces were viewed as tools of the monarchy, and were distrusted. So the revolutionary elements, which were Islamist elements, created their Revolutionary Guard Corps to enforce their will both on the population and externally. And so there's a deep distrust that goes back, and it's institutional, between the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the armed forces. And there have been a lot of stories about how the regular military feels that it's been starved of weapons and capabilities and goodies that have gone to the Revolutionary Guard Corps at their expense.
So the weapons that the United States has been taking out in these 13,000 targeted airstrikes, mostly IRGC weaponry then?
Well, the IRGC controls the bulk of the missiles and drones. So those targets are largely what I would say are IRGC. Some of the aerospace forces, but a large portion of the Air Force was regular military. Some of the Navy, the main Navy has been destroyed, but the Revolutionary Guard Corps maintains a group of fast attack vessels. Probably 60% of those are operational. So it's a mixed bag. But what we can say is that a large number of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders, the IRGC, have been eliminated in Israeli and U.S. strikes. That's not the case among the regular military. The senior leadership certainly has been taken out, but there are a lot less of their lower level, senior, middle, and lower level commanders that have been taken out, like the Revolutionary Guard Corps.
I'm just going to ask you to blue sky a little bit here, Joseph. This sounds like the sort of suspicious relationship that existed between the SS and the Wehrmacht in the 1930s and until the Second World War ended. Is that a valid comparison? And then the second question follows from it. We don't really have an idea of how President Trump thinks this is going to end. Is it possible that he is thinking that at some point the military is going to finish the job and destroy the IRGC?
So what I would say is you're absolutely right. The relationship, from what I understand, between the Revolutionary Guard and the regular military is very much that SS relationship to the German army. That same sort of relationship that the Roman legions had with the Praetorian Guard. So there's not a lot of love lost between the two organizations. And I think certainly that one of the options that the U.S. and Israel were hoping would be to see that the military would step up and take out the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the elements of the security apparatus that keep the government in power. I think they also thought there'd be a bigger rising in the streets. But, there are a lot of questions around whether people have been armed to do that or not. And the opposition is very diverse.
Well, at the start of the operation, end of February, I think it was, President Trump indicated that this wasn't going to take long. It was all about preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Then it was to destroy Iran's military capabilities. Then it was to end Iranian support for their proxies. Then it was about regime change, and then it was about a negotiated settlement, which of course didn't happen, which brings us to today's blockade of the Gulf of Hormuz. Now, when you rattle off the headlines like that, it seems to be supporting the view that Mr. Trump didn't have a plan, doesn't know what he's doing, and is obviously got himself into this predicament that is going to be hard to get out of honorably. But 6 weeks later, it's not Iran blocking the Strait of Hormuz, it's the United States, and the Iranian regime is still defiant. So was there ever a strategy that Trump was using?
So what I would say to that, Nigel, is that, militaries win wars when they achieve their strategic objectives, and you just rattled them off. Eliminating the Iranian nuclear capability, degrading their missile and drone forces, their air force, their navy, cutting them off from their proxies, and regime change. And so these are very high objectives. The Iranian objective was simply to survive, was to endure, to maintain the regime and as much of their strategic capabilities as they could. And so for Iran, they're fairly, low-level goals as opposed to the U.S. and Israeli objectives in the war. I think that there is a strategy. I think that the strategy, if you look at the targeting and how the war is unfolded, there were very heavy hits early on all the elements that the Iranians have to make war and their senior leadership. And they continued to pummel that leadership and nuclear scientists and others, so that circumstances were ripe for regime change if the opposition on the ground or the army or some other element of society decided to rise up. And when that didn't happen, and ceasefire deal came, or talks came, they went to have a ceasefire talk. I think to let the pressure off internationally and kind of cool things, hoping the Iranians might come back to the table with some real concrete offers, including getting rid of their nuclear program. The Iranians completely stonewall that, weren't interested. And so now we have the United States shutting down traffic to Iranian ports, which is effectively strangling their economy. And I fully expect that we'll see the Iranians get pretty excited in the next few days as their dollars dry up, and other commodities. And keep in mind their refining capacity in a matter of 13 to 14 days. Their storage facilities for their oil and gas and stuff is going to be chock block, and they're going to have to shut down their refining capability.
And the significance of that is what?
Means that their economy is going to tank, and that's going to tank the money for the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the regime, and that's going to tank money for their proxy militias and put a real crimp in the social life of the Revolutionary Guard Corps.
But meanwhile, I think it's fair to say that the Revolutionary Guard Corps would be the last people to feel the economic pinch. Everybody else will be starving, but they'll still have something. So how do you actually bring those people literally to a close?
There's a lot of stories about the Revolutionary Guard Corps sending, economic assets out of the country, sending their families out of the country to places like Canada, as a matter of fact, doing different things to try and protect themselves and their interests. When you fragment a regime and you fragment it at the top, one of the things that you do is you make it very difficult for people to choose between their own personal interests and their economic interests and those of the regime. And so by hitting those Revolutionary Guard leaders in their pocketbooks, and remember the regime in their pocketbooks, you start to see fractures in the regime, and that leads to a situation where you might see regime change. I think there are already stories that the speaker has more clout than who's a former IRGC senior officer than the president and the foreign minister. You saw in the negotiations a delegation of about 60 Revolutionary Guard Corps and military people showed up in Pakistan to try and get what they wanted through in the negotiations. You're seeing the IRGC head tell the speaker that you shook hands with the Americans, and our supreme leader's not even buried yet. So those cracks in the regime are starting to occur, and life is starting to get very difficult for people.
Any idea how many IRGC members have their families safely hidden away in Canada?
Well, there's supposed to be at least 1,000 IRGC in Canada, and there's supposed to be a large number of elites that have come here, and that's only through what you see in open source reporting. I would guess, and you're seeing similar things in the United States. They've just removed a couple senior family members of former IRGC leaders and Iranian leaders in the United States. So these people exist all over the place in Britain, France, different Western countries.
So maybe the desperate drive to martyrdom isn't quite as extreme as we have been led to believe.
Well, it just seems that people like to keep their options open. Martyrdom seems to be an optional extra for some members of the elite.
So the stories since Monday have been that empty oil tankers are now heading for the U.S. Gulf Coast to fill up, and they can't buy from Iran, so they're buying from America. America isn't the only place with oil for sale. How big a deal is that? Is it going to solve any problems for the Americans?
Well, certainly it makes the Americans a fair chunk of change, and it does ease the oil needs of their allies. I mean, China will get oil wherever it can, and it was getting it from Venezuela. Will likely get it from Russia. Venezuelan oil would now be of interest, and maybe Mexican oil, and certainly Canadian oil if we could get around ourselves and actually get our oil and gas industry up and running at full tilt. We would have a lot to offer the world right now.
Do you think the Yanks would actually let the Chinese buy oil from Venezuela?
I think the United States would do what's in its natural interest. And right now, the Americans have been quite clear that the Chinese are hoarding oil and that they have not been a good partner in helping to deal with this crisis. And we've seen, two Chinese or Chinese tanker twice now try to enter into the blockade and turn around and retreat back away. And we saw the Treasury Secretary say that China wants its oil; it's not getting it through Iran.
Well, let's just talk a little bit more about China. How does the rivalry between China and the United States fit into this conflict with Iran? I mean, the idea was that we just didn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, but of course, now that China's ability to buy oil from Iran is impacted by the war, does that make the Chinese more hostile to the Americans, or does it mean that they take the Americans more seriously now than they might have under the former administration and recalibrate their plans to reclaim Taiwan? Or, what's the big picture here?
Well, I think that there's no doubt that China is a near peer competitor of the United States and Russia, and there's no doubt that both of them would have liked to have disrupted U.S. Influence and power in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf states, and they've tried. But the fact of the matter is, what China is coming to see, and what I don't think that it likes very much, is that there's one country that can project power anywhere in the world at any time and do it successfully in a way that the Russian and the Chinese militaries can't. And that is the United States. And so I think the Chinese have now had a little bit of pause to rethink their position. I don't suspect that the regime is as confident as it was in Beijing, and you're continuing to see purges of its military leadership, including the only elements that had any combat experience. And I think that is causing a little bit of consternation in Beijing as well, and the widespread corruption through the military. And you're seeing, this purge of the Secretary Generals continue, but there may also be elements of the old Chinese guard that are actually purging allies of the president to disrupt his concentration of power. So I think that the Chinese are finding themselves in a bit of a spot.
Well, indeed. Given that is the case, let's say we take that theory and run with it. Does it make sense for the Chinese to offer the Iranians sophisticated weaponry of the kind that possibly could attack a U.S. carrier?
Yeah, so the news reports are that the Chinese have offered man-portable air defense missiles to the Iranians, which the Iranians would use, way to try and defend themselves because their air defenses have failed. And there have been, all kinds of reports on that, and the Chinese have denied it. And I suspect that if they could disrupt the Americans in some way, that would make them kind of feel better in Beijing. The same with the Russians. They both have provided intelligence support, and they probably provided some other aid. There were even reports that two Chinese freighters had been filled with precursor chemicals for the Iranian missile forces. I don't think that it's in their interest to do that in the way it's in the U.S. interest to arm Taiwan. And I think that the Chinese would be very reluctant to give the Iranians what are called killer missiles, which are ballistic missiles geared to attack ships at sea. U.S. aircraft carrier has got 6,000 people on it. You whack a U.S. aircraft carrier and kill 6,000 people, we're no longer talking about a naval blockade and B-52 bombers.
Well, you wouldn't be, but then perhaps there are elements in China that would say this is it. We've been waiting for this day for a long time. Let's go for it.
I think the Chinese are enjoying the fact that U.S. attention's on the Middle East and that U.S. military assets are being used up and drawn to the Middle East. And I think that if you're in China, you're following that old rule of when your adversary makes a mistake, let them. The U.S. has dragged a lot of its military power out of the Pacific, but I think that there are ways that the U.S. is compensated for that, likely, and it causes the Chinese planning capability some problems. I mean, I think the Chinese would like to see an end to this so they can get their oil and gas flowing again. And they seem to enjoy their ability to be a disruptor. I mean, poor Vladimir Putin right now is trying to play a role in this war, and he's finding himself completely shoved off to the edge of the stage where he's not drawing too much attention. And so the best the Russians can do is say, well, give us your enriched Iranian uranium, and we'll look after it for you. That's the best that the Russians have been able to do.
How do we know who won when it's over?
Well, I think that's the big issue. And I think that going with a ceasefire was probably the right thing to do politically and for optics, but it was the wrong thing to do militarily. It's given the Iranians a chance to reposition their missiles, to dig out launchers, to rearm themselves and get ready for the next round. And there will be a next round. I think it's inevitable at this stage, unless their economy collapses and we see the regime change from within. Having said that, the gravity for a U.S. victory or an Israeli victory, because of the objectives they set for themselves, is very high. The Iranians just have to survive. They just have to endure. So if we see at the end of this the Iranians in control of the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz, which can't be allowed to continue, you're going to see that the Iranians come out of this much further ahead than they would have otherwise. The challenge for the United States and Israel is they need to really pull apart their nuclear program, get rid of their missiles, and cut them off from the proxy militias, and really establish a new regime. And the regime that's in place now is hardline elements of the last regime. So it's not a new regime. They're not pragmatic thinkers or new schoolboys on the street. These guys are hardcore members of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they're killers and butchers and thugs.
Okay, well, we must hope that the Iranian military takes the opportunity if it presents itself as being more reasonable people. We are sadly out of time. Joseph Varner, thank you very much for joining us and talking about the situation, which really is very hard to talk about. Who knows what's going to happen, but you've offered us some deep things to think about. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.